And now for today's program. Yossi Klein Halevi is a senior fellow at the Shalom Hartman Institute in Jerusalem. Together with Imam Abdullah Antepli of Duke University, he co-directs the Institute's Muslim Leadership Initiative, which teaches emerging young Muslim American leaders about Judaism, Jewish identity, and Israel. Yossi is the author of several books, including the 2018 New York Times bestseller, Letters to My Palestinian Neighbor, and Little Dreamers, which won the 2013 Jewish Book Council's Everett Book of the Year Award. Yossi writes for leading op-ed pages in the United States, including the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, and he is a former contributing editor to the New Republic. Amy E. Schwartz is Moment Magazine's book and opinion editor, as well as editor of the magazine's popular Ask the Rabbi section. She recently won first place in commentary from the Religion News Association. Before coming to Moment, Amy was a longtime editorial writer and op-ed columnist at the Washington Post, where she was nominated for a Pulitzer Prize in commentary. Amy is president of the Non-Denominational Jewish Study Center in Washington, D.C., and is the editor of the book Can Robots Be Jewish? And Other Pressing Questions of Modern Life. Please welcome Yossi Klein Halevi and Amy E. Schwartz.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for coming on. And thank you, Yossi, for making time to talk to us.
Thanks for having me, Amy. It's great to be with you.
It's great to be with you, too. I just want to start by saying you are someone we always love to talk to. And one reason, not to put you on the spot, but one reason that we turn to you is that you have, throughout your writing career and your life, you've been very public about going through a lot of changes. You've had a lot of different views about different things. You've inhabited different parts of the political spectrum, and the religious spectrum, and you've changed your mind about things. And I just want to throw you in at the deep end by asking, is this right now in Israel, is this war a thing that's changed you, made you change your mind?
It's changed me emotionally. I don't think it's fundamentally changed the way I think about the conflict. Um, I've been a centrist on the Palestinian issue for almost all of my time as an Israeli. I moved to Israel in 1982, working, by the way, for Moment Magazine in those early years as a contributing editor. And my position has been fairly constant since then, which is that a Palestinian state, on the one hand, is an existential need for Israel, but it's also an existential threat. And October 7th, it seems to me, has reinforced both of those conclusions. On the one hand, creating a Palestinian state on our most sensitive border, which is the West Bank, bordering Greater Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, and risking the creation of another Hamas-run entity there, is an existential threat. On the other hand, it seems to me that October 7th has only confirmed the wisdom of Ariel Sharon's withdrawal from Gaza. How do we create one state between the river and the sea, between these two peoples? It's a fairy tale. It's a disaster. It would be a worse disaster even than what we're experiencing today. So ideologically, I remain a centrist, which is I'm at that very difficult meeting point between recognizing the truth of the left's position and the truth of the right's position. And if you push me, well, make up your mind. I would say even now, again, that I'm a little bit more afraid of the absence of a two-state solution than I am of the creation of a two-state solution, and but just barely.
And where do you think that? How do you think that locates you in among the people, the Israelis that you see around you? Have people become? Has that changed the balance for a lot of people? Are people more frightened?
Yeah, absolutely. What I've just said would have been a fairly normative position in Israel pre-October 7th, probably representing 40%, 50%, maybe more of the population. Today, much smaller. But that's, to my mind, that's more of an understandable emotional reaction. And I think that as we distance from the trauma of October 7th, the realization that we have to extricate ourselves from the occupation, from ruling over another people, will become a mainstream idea again in Israel. It's premature for that to happen, but I think inevitably it will, because the Palestinians aren't going away. This problem isn't going away, and we tried to wish it away for the last 20 years, and October 7th was a result.
Hmm. Well, you wrote a book, the last book you wrote, the bestseller, Letters to My Palestinian Neighbor, um, it seemed like an attempt to make headway in that direction towards making Palestinians understand how you or other Israelis might feel. Before all this, I mean, is that all gone now, first of all? Yeah.
Well, not at all, because what tended to get overlooked in the reviews of the book, or the ways in which it's been discussed in the media, and the book has had a kind of a revival since October 7th, and I'm very appreciative of that, even though emotionally I don't think I'd be able to write that book today. I don't think I'd be, not because I disagree with anything that I wrote there, but I don't think I would have the emotional capacity to empathize with the Palestinian narrative,
Hmm.
which that book really was an attempt to do.
Hmm.
I certainly am trying to keep my heart open to Palestinian suffering, but that's different from making the leap into trying to come to terms with the Palestinian counter narrative. And right now, I'm too much of a mainstream Israeli to go that far.
Talk a
But
little bit more about that. How would you characterize the feeling? I mean, what is the emotional tone of the mainstream Israeli?
I just saw a tweet today. Someone wrote about my book, about the letters book, saying, here's the post October 7th new title for the book: Letters to My Rapist, Massacring, Mutilating Palestinian Neighbor.
Oi.
And I have to tell you, there's a part of me that said, yeah, that's right.
Oh dear.
Now,
New
now,
translation.
yeah. Well, look, I you know, this idea that this book was only an attempt to try to make peace uh, was a misreading of letters, because the impetus for writing that book was that after 100 years of conflict, someone on the Israeli side needs to reach out and try to explain to the most difficult audience possible for understanding Zionism why we're there, why we came back, why we share this land with another people that's also there and has its claim. And so my first purpose, my overriding purpose, was to defend the Zionist story and to try to explain in as empathic way as possible who we are and what our story is.
Hmm.
And my second goal was to try to see if I could elicit responses from the Palestinian side that would agree to enter into a mutually empathic, difficult disagreement. And Palestinians and Israelis disagree about everything. We disagree about the origins of Zionism, about who's responsible for the Nakba. We disagree about which side is responsible for the collapse of the Oslo peace process. We can't agree about what's happening in Gaza today. We don't agree about the facts, never mind the interpretations. So I was looking to try to model a conversation of an Israeli with Palestinians who would all agree that the tragedy of this conflict is that it is a clash between right versus right, between two indigenous peoples, each of whom have the right to self-determination in this little land.
Hmm.
And I found I found those people. Not a lot, not a lot, and I didn't need a lot. In order to model that conversation, you just needed a few people. And the book was really, it was a writer's approach to peacemaking. The argument of the book was we need a new language.
Mhm.
And so I tried to write in a religious language. And in the Middle East, you will not be able to make peace without some religious imprimatur. And writing as a religious Jew to religious Muslims.
So you,
And sorry,
no, go ahead.
no, and just that the responses that I received very much resonated with that approach. And so it was really and what I felt was, even if I don't find any Palestinian response, I still need to write that book. I still need to try to tell our story to not only Palestinians but the Arabic speaking world. And I got thousands of downloads and responses from throughout the Arab and Muslim worlds, not only Palestinians.
I remember you said at the time when you launched the book that you were going to try to pursue some of those conversations. Were you able, I mean, it's a two-part question. First of all, were you able to model any of that kind of constructive, engaged disagreement?
Yeah,
That's the first
yeah.
part.
It's the book became more of a project than a book, and I recruited a group of young Arabic speakers who included Palestinians, Israelis. I had a woman from Baghdad, a young man from Egypt, from Morocco, Jordan, and we had a whole team, and they actively promoted
Mhm.
the book in Arabic social media. So that was the first approach. Then, as a result, once the responses started coming in, um, it became a much more active project, and I was able to try to model that conversation in several ways. First of all, the paperback edition of the book, which came out a year later, uh, includes an extensive epilogue of letters from Palestinians to their Israeli neighbor, so that the book really incorporated the two narratives. And the Palestinian responses were very critical of much of what I had written. But all the letters that I chose to include in the epilogue accepted the premise that peace requires both sides to recognize the legitimacy of the other's presence. That for me was a precondition for this conversation.
So, yeah.
And then it began to take other forms. I did an American campus tour with several of the respondents, Palestinian respondents. Today, that's inconceivable, but it was possible pre-October 7th. And I also made a short film, based on my relationship with one of the very first Palestinians to respond to the book, Professor Muhammad Dejani Daoudi, who is a well-known figure in reconciliation circles. He was a professor at Al-Quds University in Jerusalem.
Yeah, he's written for us too, actually.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah,
Yeah.
in fact, I have the reprint of that he
Yes.
distributes.
Right.
And as you know, he took a group of his students, young Palestinians, to Auschwitz, and was basically thrown out of the
Yeah.
university after
Promptly
that.
lost his position.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
his car was burned. And so he's
Yeah.
someone who's really paid his dues. And we made a short film called Neighbors.
Mm.
It's available on the book's website, letterstomyneighbor.com. And if you go under the videos section, you'll see 3 5-minute segments called
Hmm.
Neighbors. And the first 5 minutes is my story. The second is his story. And the third is a recording of our first meeting.
Oh,
So
wow.
it's I think it's a very For me, it's a very moving document. So
Well, we will find that link, but I want to ask the obvious question. Let's jump forward in time, and you've alluded to this several times and so far. Is there any place in or around Israel or the Middle East where that kind of conversation can be modeled today? Or is that
the joke is my first response would be Saudi Arabia. And I grew up in the I came of age really in the 1970s when Saudi Arabia was the most dangerous enemy facing Israel. Saudi Arabia led the Arab oil boycott uh, after the Yom Kippur War, which severely damaged Israel's international relations. Almost the entire um, continent of Africa severed diplomatic ties with Israel because of the Saudi oil boycott. The Saudis, the Gulf states, and today those leading the process of normalization with Israel are the Arab oil countries. So, and 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 I haven't participated personally in Saudi Jewish Saudi Israeli contacts, but from speaking with people who have, extraordinary things are happening there.
really, in spite of everything?
One of which is they've revamped their textbooks. They're, and
Really?
in extraordinary ways, and they're preparing the way for the acceptance of a Jewish state in the Middle East. Now, I, I'm still shocked by this, and it gives me hope, by the way, for solving the Palestinian tragedy, which will not be solved in bilateral Israeli-Palestinian negotiations. That track is dead. There is we both sides know the other's positions. We know exactly what their red lines are and our red lines, and they don't begin to meet. What
And
I'm hoping for is a regional solution in which Arab countries will perhaps appeal directly to the Palestinian people and say, this is the best deal that you could get. There is no other deal than this. Your leadership has rejected every offer that was ever put on the table. And this is your last chance. And I'm hoping that in that way, with the strong backing of our Arab partners, and even just saying that word, our Arab partners, it's so disorienting, especially now.
especially now.
But we shouldn't forget that.
Interesting.
We really have Arab partners. So that gives me a measure of hope.
So if you see a line from here to there, is that how does it go through Saudi Arabia? Is that what you see?
Yeah, yeah, it goes through Saudi Arabia
Wow.
and the Gulf states
Uh-huh.
and Morocco, which is also another country where one can still have these conversations. I was in Morocco a year ago, obviously pre-October 7th, but I went with my partner in Muslim Jewish work, Imam Abdullah Antepli of Duke University, and we went to try to create a program for young Moroccan leaders to come to the Hartman Institute in Jerusalem and study Judaism in Israel. And the response was overwhelming
This was how long ago?
a year ago.
Mm-hmm.
And look, it's not possible now,
Right.
but I believe it will be possible again in the future.
I wanted to ask you actually about that anyway. I wanted to ask one of the fascinating things you do at the Hartman Institute, you and Imam Antepli, is this Muslim Leadership Institute. And it's been going on for some years now,
10 years.
10 years. Tell me what's happened to that since October 7th and where things are. I mean,
Yeah,
how have
so
those
yeah,
relationships changed?
so we've graduated about 170 emerging Muslim American leaders. They were emerging at the time. Many of them have emerged, and the good news is that we bet rightly on a fairly large number of impressive leaders. The bad news is that the program, the graduates of the program, have either been intimidated into silence or in some cases actively participated are participating in what I would call the lynch mob against Israel and Zionism and against the mainstream American Jewish community. And this has been an extremely painful moment for me in certainly in that respect. It's an added layer of pain to all the rest of what's going on. And I by no means will give up on this work, but we certainly need to rethink some basic approaches.
Oh, can you talk more about that? I mean, are there things you were doing that you now see weren't, you have to be couched differently, or things you're learning from
And
them?
it's interesting. One of our approaches in the program was not to do the Holocaust. And the reason for that was, I'd say, twofold. One is we wanted our participants to understand that Israel's legitimacy is not based on the Holocaust. It's based on a 4,000-year story.
Mm.
So we began the program where it should begin with Lech Lecha, with the segment in the book of Genesis where God tells Abraham, "Go to the land that I will show you." And when the first day of the first cohort, one of the participants, who has since become a prominent journalist, I won't mention his name, raised his hand and said, "So wait a minute, are you saying that you're here not because of the Holocaust, but because you have a 4,000-year connection to this land?" And Abdullah, who was sitting next to me, leaned over and whispered to me, "Dayenu. We've already, the program's already a success." And
Huh.
that's how and the second reason, and this Abdullah really emphasized, is that in the Muslim world, uh, there is this normative idea that Israel exists only because of the Holocaust. And so we didn't want to feed that. Now, in retrospect, and especially looking at some of the comments that some of the graduates have made since October 7th, which is basically not only accusing Israel of war crimes, but of genocide, accusing Israel of another Holocaust. I think that you can't avoid Holocaust education. And we did touch on it in the sense of trying to explain how the Holocaust impacts on Jewish identity today. In that sense, we did deal with it, but I think that it needs a deeper and more systematic approach. So that's one example, and I think that we also miscalculated the impact of of the Muslim American community and its intimidation process. Some of our people who did speak up initially and calling for a change in how Muslims view the legitimacy of Israel were hounded, were virtually excommunicated, and so we needed a better strategy
These were
than.
people you knew who had started out speaking up, and then you
No,
noticed
no, these were
silence?
people who graduated the program and as a
Right.
result of what they learned,
Yeah.
went public. But some of those people in the last months went in the opposite direction.
Hmm. Is
And
that because they have paid a price by their peers, or is it because hundreds of their family members maybe were killed, or some combination of the two?
I will leave the speculation
Yeah.
to others. So,
Yeah. Have you retained any other than I mean, maybe Abdullah Antepli, have you retained any personal
oh,
relations
sure.
with
Sure.
anybody from Gaza?
Um, from Gaza itself, no.
Or of Gaza?
No, I have there were two people who responded to my book with letters of their own that are included in the epilogue, who both grew up in Gaza. And those relationships have been strained.
Mm.
And I understand that. I have
Sure.
been a vocal supporter of the necessity of this war, and I still am. And I certainly understand people who are losing family members and look at me and say, you know, you've betrayed us. You were supposed to be for reconciliation, you know, and for me, there was no question on October 8th that if I have to choose between my commitment to Israel's physical well-being and my commitment to reconciliation efforts, I choose survival, and I had to be willing to pay the price for that. And so it's painful, but I couldn't live with myself if I didn't make that choice.
Yeah, I wasn't trying to put you on the spot. I was just thinking so few people, there are so few people you can even ask that question of because there isn't that much interpersonal
Right.
bridge building. Um, so, but it sounds like what you said before. I mean, you say you're a believer in the war and you support the need for it. But it sounds like from what you said before that you don't see this problem being solved militarily.
No, but I think that destroying Hamas, Hezbollah, the Iranian axis that's on our borders is a prerequisite for an eventual agreement. There
Mhm.
will be no possibility for an agreement if we are surrounded on almost every border by proxies of Iran. And until October 7th, we were living in this dream state of imagining that we could maintain reasonably normal lives in Israel with these genocidal regimes or terror entities on our borders. And October 7th taught us in the most visceral way possible that if you have neighbors who are committed to your destruction and repeat that every day, sooner or later you're going to wake up into October 7th.
Mm. Yeah,
So,
that's so just to go back to the path to hope that you mapped out earlier. I just want to ask one more geopolitical question, and then we'll switch and talk about sort of more of the moral dimensions that you've been taking up. In this road to a solution that might or might not run through Saudi Arabia and Morocco and places like that, and the Gulf, do you see the U.S. as being a constructive partner?
to some extent, not as much as the US thinks it is, but certainly more than the Israeli right would downplay. So I think somewhere between a certain grandiosity of that's still left over from the 20th century in American policy thinking. I think that the American position in the Middle East, American credibility has been severely undermined, not because the US has been so pro-Israel. That's American credibility has been undermined on American campuses, but not in the Arab world. What has undermined American credibility is the fact that Iran is on the threshold of a nuclear breakthrough. And that exactly what Israelis and Arabs feared would happen as a result of Obama's deal with Iran is now playing out. And
Even
so
without the deal, didn't the deal didn't even end
the
up
deal the deal never had a chance. The deal
right.
was an illusion from the beginning. And in this case, to blame Trump for canceling a deal that was a disaster uh, uh, in its conception and in its execution is misplaced. One can certainly blame Trump for much else, but not for destroying the possibility of a of preventing a nuclear Iran.
Interesting. So, well, we don't have to get into the side issue about whose deal was more terrible. But I wanted to ask you, one of the things you've talked and written about a lot over the years has been sort of the implication, and you talk about this in the book also, the difference between sort of the effect of powerlessness on the Jewish sort of psyche and, how the approach to the world and how that changes when Jews are no longer powerless. I'm curious, like right now, it's almost as if Israelis are experiencing both power and powerlessness at the same time.
Yeah, yeah. I think that we tend, um, not only in the diaspora but in Israel too, post October 7th, to confuse powerlessness with vulnerability. We're not powerless. You
Hmm.
just have to look at what we've done to Gaza to to understand that. And there's really something, how shall I put it delicately? Um, we don't have the right to see ourselves as victims. The first responsibility in assuming power is to give up the protection of victim.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't go with power. A country that is able to devastate its neighbor has no right to victimhood, nor should we want to be victims. That's not our identity. The Israeli ethos is antithetical to victimhood. That's one of the purposes of Zionism.
Hmm.
And so what happened to us on October 7th was a temporary lapse into the condition of victimhood. On October 7th, we truly were victims. And the psychological shock of that is going to be with Israelis for a very long time to come. Because what happened on October 7th was an epic failure of Zionism.
Hmm.
We failed to protect our own people within the sovereign borders of Israel. We are a country that sent commandos in 1976 halfway across Africa to rescue 100 Israelis who were being held captive in Entebbe. And we couldn't save 1,200 Israelis within our own borders. So that's an historic shock. But on October 8th, we instantly pivoted back into power. And we made a decision. The entire Jewish society in Israel made a decision, and I'm including the left with very, very few exceptions. A few people who write for Haaretz. The entire mainstream left was on board for this war.
Hmm.
And so we made a decision as a society to repudiate the disastrous perception of a return of victimhood. But since October 7th, our vulnerability has been exposed. We we are we're not weak, but we're nowhere near as strong as we thought we were.
Hmm.
And the fact that Hamas, our weakest enemy, was able to deliver the most devastating blow in our history is really part of that psychological dissonance that we're feeling.
Do you think people take that on themselves as a whole, that the society feels that failure to self-protect? It's not localized on, for instance, Netanyahu?
No, look, Netanyahu's failures are are historic, really, and
Dramatic.
what he's done to Israel over the last year and a half is, look, Netanyahu presented Israel with two scenarios of our destruction. Until October 7th, the scenario of the Netanyahu government was an internal unraveling. This is what the end of Israel looks like when we can no longer find the most basic commonality, when Israelis begin to actively hate each other.
Hmm.
And that was scenario number one.
Sinat Chinam, right? How the temple falls.
Absolutely. And that was the internal unraveling. October 7th presented us with the scenario of an external destruction. Your borders are overrun. You can't protect your civilians. The army is in complete chaos. That was the second scenario. And so Netanyahu has done what no leader in Israel ever did, which was create the conditions for a kind of a pre-enactment in different ways of Israel's destruction. So I don't minimize the blame at all, but on Netanyahu. But in terms of the society as a whole, I think that this will be the longest lasting trauma of October 7th, long after the active memory of the trauma of the massacre itself starts to fade. It won't ever entirely fade, but begins to lose some of its edge. We are going to continue grappling with the legacy of the failure of self-protection, the failure of the Zionist promise to create a safe refuge for the Jewish people.
Yeah, it's in some ways it sounds like you're saying it's not just the promise of the last century, but it brings back all that trauma from all the millennia before, right? I mean, it's the return of a lot of repressed.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, it's so interesting if you look at the story of the return to power, the post-Holocaust story of the re-empowerment of the Jewish people in Israel through hard power, through military power and national sovereignty, and the diaspora through soft power, through philanthropy and political lobbying and creating alliances with other groups. The Jewish return to power from the very beginning, starting in 1948, was accompanied by an active attempt to destroy our power. And the war against Jewish power never stopped for a moment, against the legitimacy of the Jewish reclamation of power. And so built into the story of the success of Zionism, or the success of the two flags on the bima of American synagogues, is the counter story of the war to try to destroy our return to power. And October 7th is a turn of the spiral in that war, a drastic intensification of the war against the legitimacy of Jewish power.
Well, that is a segue to diaspora and campus politics. But just before we go there, I know you've just been on our campuses, and I want to talk about that next. But just before we go there, the sort of the ultimate case of what to do about powerlessness, it seems to me, is this question about the hostages. And I just wonder whether, I mean, how do you do right by people in that situation? How much do we weigh the experience of hostages and hostage families against other things?
What's made this so painful, excruciatingly painful, is that the dilemma of how far to compromise our goal of destroying Hamas in order to save the hostages is that it pits against each other two essential facets of the Israeli ethos. On the one hand, there's the old Jewish ethos, which we absorbed into Israeliness, which is you don't leave any Jew behind. Pidyon Shvuyim, redeeming the captives. That defined Jewish solidarity for 2,000 years of exile, and it defined Israeli solidarity. So that's on the one hand, that's one non-negotiable value. The other non-negotiable value is that you defend yourself against a genocidal threat. Now, Hamas is not an immediate genocidal threat, but if we fail to destroy Hamas, if Hamas emerges from this war claiming victory and is able to reform itself on our border, our military credibility, our deterrence is going to be shot. October 7th will stand as the last word on this time. And that, I believe, would be the beginning of the decline of Israeli power in the Middle East. So I do see this as a long-term, or maybe not such a long-term threat, an existential threat.
Mm.
So what do you do? Until recently, I felt we have to continue fighting the war and bring Hamas down. Now, for various reasons, I've shifted, and I think we need to prioritize the hostages. First of all, because it's clear that the hostages are being murdered, and or are in conditions in which they are dying.
Mm.
And the other reason that I feel this new urgency is that there's a strategic consequence to not rescuing the hostages. And that is that many Israelis will stop believing in the Israeli ethos. Many Israelis will say, well, this isn't the country that I signed up for. If we would not, because it means, what if I fall into, what if I become a hostage? What if my kids become hostages? I can't depend on my own government to save them. It undermines the most basic credibility of Israeli solidarity, and that will impact on our willingness to defend each other. So I think that ultimately, for very compelling strategic reasons, we need to prioritize the hostages.
Mhm. So let's take a breath. I mean, I don't know if you have any thoughts on what that would look like. I don't, I mean, prioritizing the hostages, just we'll see what.
I think it may mean having to accept the fact that we will not finish the war.
Hmm. Eh, something else. So all right. So enough about you. Let's talk about us. Let's talk about the diaspora. You've just done a campus tour, and right now, you described it as a not book tour, like a tour you're making instead of writing a book,
That's the anti-book tour.
the anti-book tour. And currently, you're talking to us from Vancouver, which at least has the advantage of not being an American college campus. But tell us what you are hearing. I mean, I think you said something earlier that made me think of this, the question of the delegitimization of Jewish power, whether that's, somehow been redoubled in the diaspora. Tell us what you're seeing.
Well,
First
I
of all, where
went
were you?
say it again.
First of all, where were you? What campuses?
So I was on 5 campuses: Columbia, Penn, Northwestern, which was my alma mater, and and Berkeley. How can I forget Berkeley? And Stanford.
Oh boy.
And the interesting thing about it was that I wasn't disrupted at all, and that was
That's very interesting.
a little surprising to
Well, you
me.
were giving public lectures or classes?
Yes, public lectures and classes,
Advertised as an Israeli, as a Jew, no disruption.
no disruption.
Okay, that's
And,
a data point for me.
well, it's interesting because the arrangement that I made with my hosts was that I would not speak at Hillel. I asked them to rent space in the central on campus, in a neutral non-Jewish space,
Huh.
and they all did. They all did, and there were no disruptions. Now, I've had disruptions in the past, but when I spoke on campuses, but what I've also had were mixed audiences: Jewish kids, non-Jewish kids. This time, it was basically Hillel kids. And my takeaway is that I wasn't disrupted because the Israel conversation on campus has become so marginalized that it almost doesn't matter anymore. And I don't know whether that's why I wasn't disrupted, but that's a feeling. And speaking to Jewish kids, and I sat down with Hillel kids on almost all those campuses before my talks. And what I heard over and over from them was that the demonstrations are creating an immediate acute sense of vulnerability, but the long-term impact on campus culture may be even more serious, which is that these demonstrations have poisoned discourse on Israel, so that even for many apolitical students, when they hear the word Israel, the first associations are colonialism, racism, and now genocide. And
Hmm.
this is an historic victory for the anti-Zionists. And the Jewish community, it seems to me, is making a mistake by only focusing on the demonstrations, on this moment, and not looking at the more systemic problem of how deeply this goes, how deeply this has penetrated, especially since October 7th, in the wider campus culture.
Hmm. In other words, people like you go to Hillel, you don't feel comfortable going to Hillel, or it's some other.
Quite the opposite is that the pro-Israel kids on campus are gravitating to Hillel and Chabad even more than in the past because they're looking for those safe spaces.
Hmm.
And many kids told me as well that their non-Jewish circle of friends has been reduced, and they're looking for like-minded Jewish friends. And that made me very sad. And 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 I heard it a lot. I heard it especially, not only, but especially at Northwestern, or maybe it just hit me especially hard at Northwestern because that experience for me studying there in the 1970s was transformative. I grew up in Borough Park in the most self-segregating Jewish community in America,
Hmm.
uh, maybe aside from the Satmar community in Kiryas Yoel, uh, but we were a close second, and Holocaust survivor family, and very much gravitated to the far right when I was a teenager. I was in the Jewish Defense League and Mayor Kahana, and going to Northwestern as a graduate student really was coming into America
Hmm.
and realizing that I can be as Jewish as I want to be in a public American space, and I would be completely accepted, and I was. And that was really, in some ways, a revelation for me. And to go back to Northwestern 45 years later and hear Jewish kids saying, we just don't feel comfortable
Hmm.
in in the larger Northwestern space
As Jews.
as Jews was
Wow. Yeah.
profoundly sad for me.
Huh. Well, that's yeah, that's very interesting. I'll let you. I see I see the queue is full of questions, and I'll let you go in a second over to Suzanne, but who will ask the questions. But I'm just, what's your sense? I mean, Israelis, you've been talking about Israelis are of course in an all Jew in a Jewish space, in a comfortable space, but also live with this awareness that they're surrounded by people who have a very different narrative and who would kill, now it turns out maybe would kill them. Um, for American students, do you have the impression that that hearing that narrative even exists was something more than they could manage? I mean, is that part of it?
Look, I feel in a way like these foreign correspondents who parachute into Israel and after 5 days are experts on the Middle
Right.
East. I only went to 5 campuses. I only had interaction for the most part with with the pro-Israel core of Jewish students. So those kids fully resonate with the Israeli narrative of vulnerability and are experiencing it in the most immediate way
Right.
themselves. So I unfortunately this time I did not interact with Jewish kids who are outside of a pro-Israel narrative. In the past, I would. but that just didn't happen. In this polarized atmosphere, it just didn't seem possible.
Mm.
And so I don't know. I don't know how to answer the question. But I do feel that Israelis need to be a little less wary. And for Israelis to be a little less wary means you will still be hyper wary, but at least to leave room for the possibility of a post-war change in the region, especially given the fact that we have allies and potential allies now in the Arab world, on the one hand. On the other hand, I would like to see American Jews resonate more deeply with Israelis' sense of vulnerability. After October 7th, I think that was very much shared in the American Jewish community, but as the months of war have dragged on, we've lost a lot of that empathy that many American Jews had with Israel's predicament. And part of what worries me about the conversation between American Jews and Israelis is that we may have missed an historic opportunity on October 7th to reset the terms of our conversation. And that now we seem to be lapsing back to pre-October 7th discourse, but maybe even more with even greater distancing, certainly on the part of many young Jews. I'm not talking about the mainstream Jewish community. I'm talking about those who are not really affiliated with it.
Yeah. Well, I hope not to end this on too depressing a note, but maybe that's some kind of bridge we will all have to think more about how to build, build that up with the young people and the older people. But Yossi, thank you. I see lots of questions in the queue. So I would go on much longer with this, but thank you for your wisdom on this and everything. It's lovely
Great to talk. Thank you.
Thank you both. Let's jump right in because there are a lot of questions. A lot of people are asking about the West Bank and the settlements and the activity going on there. What do you have to say about that? And where does this play into finding a solution?
First of all, that I'm grateful to diaspora Jews for asking that question, because it's so easy for us in Israel to focus only on the war and not look at what's festering in us. And one of the things that worries me about Israeli society is that October 7th has drastically set us back in terms of our ability to look at ourselves. In leading up to October 7th, we experienced the most extraordinary civic movement in Israel's history. We've had lots of protest movements, lots of successful protest movements. We never had a movement that took responsibility for Israel's identity and institutions. That's what the democracy movement in Israel represented. And for the first time, we were really looking at basic questions of Israeli identity. And that, of course, has been displaced. And so part of what we were looking at was the rise of Ben Gvir and Smotrich and the perversion of Israeli institutions, but handing over the Israeli police to a Khanist. I still can't believe that that's happened. I have to repeat that for myself, and yet it can become self-evident. The more the time goes on, it can just become its own reality. And so we need to ask ourselves these questions in terms of settlement violence in Judea and Samaria. This here again is an issue that I think if the Biden administration hadn't raised this with the Netanyahu government, I don't know if anything substantive would have been done. Now, I do think that belatedly we are seeing some crackdown happening, still nowhere near enough. But there are now, I think, two security forces that are at odds in how they deal with settler violence. On the one hand, there's Ben Gvir's police, which is, I believe, instructed to turn a blind eye. And then there's the Shabak, the Shin Bet, which has a long history of trying to rein in Jewish, far-right Jewish violence. And I believe is trying to do that again now, even if this government is of two minds about how to deal with this.
How does Israel balance destroying Hamas and Hezbollah with the fact of trying to find cooperation with Arab states in the region? And then I'll add to that, somebody else's question is if you could talk about the North a little bit and what it will take for those that are not living there right now and are displaced.
So the second question is easier, I think. Hezbollah has to be removed from the border, and removing it 5 kilometers or 20 kilometers is not going to do it. Now, what I've just said is really a euphemism for destroying Hezbollah. And that means that a war with Hezbollah, to my mind, is unavoidable. I don't believe that this government can wage another war. It doesn't have the moral credibility in the world. It doesn't have the ability to unite Israelis. If Netanyahu went to war today against Hezbollah, a large number of people in Israel would say he's just trying to divert the attention of Israelis from the need to go to new elections. So whether that would be true or not is almost beside the point. The fact that many Israelis would believe that would make it that much more difficult for us to fight this war effectively. So I think that we need to internalize the realization that we are not in a war with Hamas. We are in a war with Iran. What began on October 7th was the Israeli-Iranian war. It will have moving fronts. Right now, the primary front is Gaza. The front at some point will, I believe, must shift to Hezbollah. And of course, Syria is an ongoing front, and Iraq intermittently is a front, and now the Houthis. So this is really a regional war, and it's always been a regional war from 1948. It used to be a Sunni Israeli war. Now it's a Shiite Israeli war, but it still has regional dimensions, which most of the world tends to miss by focusing on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And I understand, obviously, why that is, but that's not how Israelis experience the conflict. You have to widen the lens to see this through Israeli eyes. I think that was the question.
Well, it was also balancing continued devastation and getting other Arab states.
Oh, right. How whether there isn't a tension
right
between making peace with the Sunni world and destroying Hamas. It's a very complicated dynamic because the elites in the Sunni world want us desperately to destroy Hamas. That is the worst kept secret in Israel. We know that the Saudis and the Gulf states and Egypt, for that matter, and probably Jordan, want us, though for Jordan it's more complicated because of the large numbers of Palestinians who live there. But certainly the political elites in the countries that we have relationships with want us, expect us to destroy Hamas. The problem is that their streets are actively opposed to this war. And we're in real danger of losing the legitimacy of a peace process between the Shiite world, the Sunni world, and Israel, the longer this war goes on. So there's this deep disconnect between the leadership and the peoples. That's on the one hand. What's happening in the Shiite world is the reverse, which is that certainly in Iran, where you have probably the most pro-Israel population, not only in the Middle East, but certainly in large parts of the West, and of course the Iranian regime. So you've got opposite dynamics happening in the Sunni world and the Shiite world.
Thank you. It's kind of time to wrap up, but if you're okay, I'd like to just ask a few more
Sure.
questions. So we have so many. Can you talk a little bit about the protests that are now happening in Israel? Are they just protests about bringing home the hostages, or are there other groups protesting? Also, what kind of an impact do you think that will have on the government? Along with the protests in the United States, is that going to have any kind of impact on what the Israeli government does?
In terms of the protests in the United States, it will only harden Israeli attitudes. It will only confirm that part of the Israeli psyche that sees the whole world as an enemy, or as my father used to say, the non-Jewish world is divided into two groups. There are those who actively try to destroy the Jews, and those who are secretly glad that others are doing the work. And that's very strong in part of the Israeli psyche. So no, the demonstrations will have whatever intended effect they have in the West. They will have the opposite effect in Israel. They will harden attitudes. In terms of the demonstrations in Israel, there are two main forms of protests that are happening now. One is supporting the hostages and pressuring the government to make a deal. I personally think that protest movement is counterproductive because it strengthens Hamas. It strengthens Hamas's perception of its negotiating position, and I understand why hostage families are taking to the streets. They have to do something, and there's also such a deep sense of mistrust, well-earned mistrust toward the Netanyahu government. That, but I do worry about the consequences of the hostage demonstrations. The other protest movement is a return of the pre-October 7th anti-government democratic movement. And what they're demonstrating for is to bring down the government and have new elections. And the argument is, which I more than identify with, is that with October 7th, this government lost whatever legitimacy it didn't have before October 7th. And the interesting thing here, this is not well understood abroad, is that nobody is demonstrating against this war. Now, you do have the beginnings of a debate in Israel about where's the war going, has it run its course. There is virtually no debate about the morality of the war itself. There is some debate about, are we fighting a moral war morally? That's certainly a question, but nobody is demonstrating against this war. And that's something I think that American Jews, diaspora Jews, really need to understand. And that's part of the disconnect that's between us.
Yeah, that was actually going to be part of the last question of how much longer can this war go on? And somebody else asked, what is Qatar's role going to continue to be?
Yeah, I don't know how to answer the question about Qatar, but and I don't know how to answer the question of how much longer this war will go on either. I think it is worth saying that the notion that Netanyahu will prolong this war for his own political purposes is a misreading of Israeli reality. Unlike the situation in the US, where the president is also the commander-in-chief during war, the prime minister of Israel is technically not the commander-in-chief. He's the first among equals in the war cabinet. Now, obviously, he has more say than other members of the war cabinet, but he can't unilaterally determine the course of this war. And if the army felt that Netanyahu was trying to artificially prolong the war or instigate a new front unnecessarily for his own political purposes, the army would have ways of leaking that information to the media and of letting the Israeli public know that Netanyahu is on a very dangerous course. And there's so much suspicion toward Netanyahu in Israel today that I think that his room for maneuvering is narrow here. The war cabinet, on the whole, is composed of leaders whom most Israelis respect, and I do as well. I'm thinking of Gantz and Eisenkot and Gallant, for that matter. The only member of the war cabinet whom I actively don't trust is Netanyahu, who happens to be the prime minister, but nevertheless, again, somewhat constrained. So I think that there are other factors that will determine whether we go into Rafah, for example. If Hamas really does not go for this deal, then I think we will go into Rafah. I think at that point we should, and provided that serious humanitarian provisions are in place, that we have a credible plan. And at the same time, in terms of Lebanon, while I certainly don't want to see this government, as I said earlier, to see this government in power while we take this war to its next terrible stage, a far worse stage than what we've experienced so far in Gaza. It will be a much more devastating phase of this war. If Hezbollah escalates, if things get out of control in the north, then we'll go to war. We'll go to war when that happens. So everything right now is so fluid. It's such a strange moment. And on the one hand, as an Israeli, I feel that everything is clear. The nature of the enemy we're facing, the need for us to respond, the rise of anti-Semitism around the world at precisely the moment when Hamas reveals its genocidal intentions on October 7th, we have the worst outbreak of global anti-Semitism since the Holocaust. What's that all about? And so on the one hand, everything is clear. On the other hand, nothing is clear. Where we are stuck with the most immoral government in Israel's history, fighting our most morally complicated war, our most brutal war. We have no end game. We have no credible plan. Nothing is clear. And so we're stuck at a moment, we're stuck at that, for Israelis, we're at that meeting point between absolute clarity and total confusion. And I think that that's very much informing the Israeli mood today.
And as we wrap up, do you have any words for American Jews, especially those that are big supporters of Israel, but they feel that they need to be silent? They feel stuck as well. What do you say to them?
Look, I sit at the Hartman Institute, which is one of the meeting points, really one of the I think most interesting meeting points between diaspora and Israel. And part of our mission is to encourage diaspora Jews to be more involved with the Israeli conversation, which inevitably includes critiquing Israeli policies. We can't have it both ways. If we insist and I believe rightly so, that the state of Israel is the center point of Jewish life in our time, in the way that the land of Israel for 2,000 years was the center point of Jewish imagination. The state of Israel is the center point of actual living Jewish reality. The price for that is we need to make place at the table for a diaspora voice. It doesn't obligate me as an Israeli to listen to every policy recommendation from diaspora Jews, but I certainly need to hear those critiques. I need to take those critiques into consideration, even more so after October 7th, when the consequences of what happens in Israel on the well-being and even physical safety of diaspora Jews has never been more stark. And so Israel needs to take responsibility for that. I believe passionately that American Jews need to share in this conversation, but I would hope that they would do so in a way that would allow their voices to be heard by mainstream Israelis, which means taking Israeli security concerns seriously. One of my frustrations and over the years, as someone who's been lecturing really for the last 30 years in the American Jewish community, is this growing disconnect that I was feeling with how so many diaspora Jews, really more American Jews than in other parts of the diaspora, how many American Jews were downplaying Israel's vulnerability with what really we were up against, and saying, well, you're the superpower of the Middle East, you know, what are you afraid of a Palestinian state? So yes, let's have those conversations. Let's have those critiques. Let's critique us where we desperately need to be critiqued from a credible moral Jewish perspective, but don't overlook Israel's vulnerability.
Well, Yossi, thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you, Amy, for interviewing Yossi. I wanted to let people know that Yossi has a very good podcast called For Heaven's Sake with Rabbi Daniel Hartman, who we interviewed a few weeks ago on Moment Live. And so I will send a link to that as well as Yossi's website when I do the follow-up email. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. I can go to momentmag.com and we will see everybody next time. Thank you.
Thanks,
Be well.
Suzanne. Thanks, Amy.
Thank you.
Take care.